this morning when Parminder started, he said something, and Kathy looked over at me and said something briefly. I forget what she said, but on this trip, her and I had a discussion that was probably longer than normal. I think it was a few hours. And the whole premise of the subject is that this whole message is about Daniel 11 verse 40. And if you don't understand Daniel 11 verse 40 right, then you got problems. And there was something that, but I was waxing eloquent on all the proofs of that concept, and that's where Parminder started this morning as well. I forget how he said it. But my intent, what I was thinking about when Kathy and I were having that discussion, and Parminder even said something about this too. Verse 41 and onward is significant. The Sunday law is significant in the United States and the glorious land, but it's insignificant at one level, because if you can't bring your life into agreement with verse 40, then you're not going to be on the right side of the issue in verse 41 anyway. Verse 41 and what follows thereafter follows thereafter, but verse 40 is where it all takes place. But my point was, there's things that in verse 40 that the Lord taught this movement, that put into this message, things from verse 40 that really have very little to do with the symbols of the King of the North or the overflowing whirlwind, and they're significant. And if you don't understand what those principles and rules are that were established from verse 40, it makes it difficult to be on the right side of the issue here at the end. So I wanted to say something that, because it kind of, Kathy and I never talked about it again because it was in Parminder's presentation. But as soon as he said that, she looked over. Are you listening to me, Kathy?
Not really.
Do you remember when Parminder said that this morning? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Refresh my memory. I was talking to a little boy.
I know you were. This morning where Parminder started, he talked about the significance of verse 40.
Oh, we were just talking about that.
I already told him that. I just wanted to make sure that you clicked on that this morning with me as well, right?
Yeah, I thought that was really providential that we just got that going over that.
But I'm going to use this to segue into something else that I need to say. I guess it's important to some. I had it explained to me why it's important to some that I'm clear about. When we came to understand Russia was the King of the South, we did that here in Wales, and I remember going the very next weekend to Holland and presenting the message. And I remember that when I presented the message in Wales, I was using the notes that I was given the week before. And so I was giving credit to the person that put the notes together, but after the fact, it was explained to me that everything that went on that evening was not from those notes. And so that's how I've taught it since then, and so I understand the person that put those notes together uses that claim to say that I'm saying he's lying about what he discovered. And that, I don't remember exactly why people after the fact told me, no, that was a group discussion, but as I've thought about it, I think probably what it was, there wasn't anything in those notes about how this understanding of the King of the South here at the end of time paralleled the Lord removing his hand from the fullness of the year understanding in Millerite history. That wasn't in those notes, if I recall right. But if I recall right, that very next weekend, we were already putting that in place. So there's things that, in connection with that discovery, where I may have, I don't think I misrepresented it, and I didn't do it on my own volition. I did it from input from other people that were there. But it's being misused to suggest that I'm saying things about a person that I'm not really saying. If you think I am, you just don't understand me. Then this is what I'm segueing into. I never understood the daily. I was a worldly person until I was 25 years old and became a Christian, and I started studying and so on and so forth and developed my understanding. But I didn't know what the daily was in the book of Daniel. But I needed to know what the daily was in the book of Daniel because it becomes an important prophetic principle if you're going to rightly understand Daniel 11:40 to 45. You have to be correct. You have to understand the pioneer position is correct, and sooner or later you're going to have to understand why all these theological positions are incorrect. And the Lord put me into a training on that subject to where, for a while, I'm pretty sure I was the main expert on the daily in Adventism, because I was handling it all the time. I knew all the arguments against it, but it didn't start that way. It did not start that way. I didn't even know that the daily was something to understand, and I don't remember how I came across it, but I came across a 2-hour presentation by a guy, and it was a good presentation, and it was accurate, and it was on the daily, and that's where I learned what the daily was. I learned why it was significant, and from that point on, I still had a lot to learn about the daily, but I was grounded. I was on the pioneer side of the equation, and from there on I began to learn about the daily, and then thereafter I realized, hey, you need to be right on the daily if you're going to be right on Daniel 11:40-45. Later on, years later, as I'm getting moved out of working with self-supporting ministries, off all by ourselves now, there was an Egyptian guy, a multimillionaire, Seventh-day Adventist, that believed that the message for Adventism was that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was Babylon, and he sent out messages to the major self-supporting ministries around the world, saying, we're going to have a meeting in Florida, and if you want to come and attend, I'll pay your way or whatever, and we're going to have a big meeting. And what I want all you self-supporting ministries to do is accept the fact that the truth of the hour is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is Babylon, and let's get united and let's carry this to the world, and I'll bankroll it. So all these ministries went down to Florida to get their share of the Egyptian money. And by that time, most of these self-supporting ministries really didn't like our ministry. They were really at odds with our ministry. I didn't go to that meeting, even though we got an offering from the Egyptian in advance of that meeting for $3,000 or $4,000. But I wasn't going to go because I knew what was up, and I wasn't. Anyway, I didn't go. But at that meeting, the very guy that had presented this 2-hour presentation on the daily that I'd listened to years before, that indoctrinated me into the truth, he stood up in that meeting and he took a pledge in front of all these people that he, no matter what, he was going to spend the rest of his time in public service bringing down the ministry Future for America. He was totally on the warpath against our ministry, full speed ahead. And, you know, it was quite a interchange for some period of time with this guy. But that's the guy I learned what the daily was. It was from this guy. Before it was all said and done, he kind of disappeared off into oblivion. I never hear about this guy anymore. But before it was all said and done, he reversed his understanding of the daily. He went back to the apostate Protestant position. My point is I can think back. There's a guy right now, we just put out this documentary on the desolations of Jerusalem, and there's a guy that's left this message. Anyway, he's left this message, and he borderlined on one email to us of threatening to sue us because somehow that video that we produced was stealing his material. It didn't steal his material at all. Nothing to do with stealing his material. But there were things that brother contributed while he was in the message that were significant from my perspective, from my human perspective. But I actually, since he left the message, I've only received 3 emails from him, and one of them he didn't intend to send me. It was accidental. So I've only received 2 actually purposely, and I received one this morning. That's how often I hear from this guy, and I received one from him this morning as well. But my point is, when he was still engaged in the message years ago, 2005, he calls me. He says, "Hey, Brother Jeff, you need to read these articles by Hiram Edson." Okay, because Hiram Edson claims that the glorious land is the United States. That was big stuff, because we were in an argument that the glorious land was either the United States as we understood it or the Seventh-day Adventist Church as the Adventist Church understands it. And here we had a pioneer, Hiram Edson, saying that. And it just so happened in those very articles, Hiram Edson is making the argument that William Miller was wrong on the 25-20, and William Miller should have selected the 25-20 against the Northern Kingdom. And that's where the 25-20 came into this movement, from that person that is now totally against this message. Okay? So I just want to put in the public record that the idea that if the Lord chooses to use someone to open up a truth, that somehow puts a seal of approval on them where they can never stumble or fall or turn against the message, that's absolutely ridiculous. It's not consistent with Advent history. I mean, did not Sister White put the seal of approval on Jones and Wagner? What happened to Jones and Wagner? Did she not call John Harvey Kellogg the Lord's physician? Okay, so I don't know where we get those kind of concepts here in the here and now, but our walk with the Lord is a day-to-day choice that we're all going to make, and the Lord can use a donkey to speak to us if he needs to, right? Anyone. So some of you know what I'm inferring here about what I've just said, and I put it in the public record. I don't have any problem with what went on here in Wales in 2016, got opened up at that time. But whatever went on there didn't secure anyone's into the message. They can still turn against it. Okay. I don't know that I'll get there, but the reason that I was thinking about Daniel 11:40, moving back to that thought, is because all this history that we're grappling with now with Rafi and Paniam, or even Islam, of 9/11, and Islam of the Midnight Cry, it all takes place in verse 40. Everything that we're grappling with that is present truth takes place in verse 40, whether it's the development of the church triumphant, or it's the role of Islam, or apostate Protestantism, it's all there in that verse. But the way we originally understood that verse was very simplistic, but it was still accurate. I don't know if you've ever thought about it. We basically were teaching that in 1989, verse 40 has reached its conclusion with the collapse of this, what we would say the Soviet Union, but we could say the collapse of the King of the South, right? And that is pretty much going to be the end of verse 40, is the collapse of the King of the South. Maybe we have a little bit of time between the Midnight Cry and the Sunday Law, perhaps, but the Midnight Cry is the first Sunday Law. So I was fascinated on my way over here about verse 40 and all the implications that are in that verse. And it just kind of amazed Kathy and I this morning, and we hadn't had any time to talk about it, that Parminder put the same thought in the record. Let me get tuned up here on these notes. I've been telling people for a little bit of time that this particular study we're going to do here can be found in Habakkuk's tables. And I looked for it in Habakkuk's tables and it's not there. But I know we put it in the public record more than once, and probably most of you in this room have already heard this presentation that I'm going to deal with now. I'm switching gears from the 391s. That's in the background now. I'm going to go back to the covenant lines and develop some things out of covenant lines. But I'm going to start with the story of Noah. And I thought it was in the Habakkuk's tables studies, but it's not. Somewhere else we put in the public record that in the time of Noah, Enoch, Methuselah, and Noah are the three angels' messages. Okay, and you can go through in a very precise fashion, demonstrate that fact. And I want to do that because I'm going to take the logic of a sermon that was did at Lambert Church within the past 2 months by George Seaman. I don't know if any of you have taken the time to look at that sermon, but you should. And although it was an incomplete, he didn't touch every line that he could. He basically showed that in the reform movements that are dealing with God's covenant people, just before you get to the time period where the close of probation is going to be marked, then the element of time is opened up, and it tests God's people. And because you can see this illustrated throughout the history of the covenant lines, then what it's speaking to us is that just before the close of our probation as priests, we should expect the line of the tribe of Judah to open up some element of time that we will be tested by. So George didn't put this in place. He started with Abraham. But I'm going to start with Enoch, Methuselah, and Noah. And I'm going to suggest that that's the first, second, and third angel's message. And for those of you that are familiar with the Reform lines, you know that Noah is an easy one to put at the third angel's message, right? Because in the story of Noah, what happens? The door closes. That's the classic example that we use for that third step. So you may argue that maybe Enoch and Methuselah aren't the first and second angel's messages, but to start with, in Testimonies, Volume 6, page 392. And I'm sorry, I don't do the points, so I don't know which one it is. It says, pardon me, 6T. Testimonies, Volume 6, page 392. The power of Christ, the crucified Savior, to give eternal life should be presented to the people. We should show them that the Old Testament is as verily the gospel in types and shadows as the New Testament is in its unfolding power. The New Testament does not present a new religion. The Old Testament does not present a religion to be superseded by the New. The New was as verily saved. The New Testament is only the advancement and unfolding of the Old. Abel was a believer in Christ and was as verily saved by his power as was Peter or Paul. Enoch was a representative of Christ as surely as was the beloved disciple of John. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Now, here's the point that I want you to get. Enoch walked with God, and God took him. To Enoch, was committed the message of the second coming of Christ. And I'm going to argue that the message of the second coming of Christ was also committed to William Miller. Okay, Enoch was given the same message as William Miller. Okay, to him, Enoch was committed the message of the second coming of Christ. Now it's going to quote from Jude 14 and 15. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all. The message preached by Enoch and his translation to heaven were a convincing argument to all who lived in his time. These things were an argument that Methuselah and Noah could use with power to show that the righteous could be translated. And I also want you to see in here that Sister White is selecting those three, Enoch, Methuselah, and Noah. Because if you look in the genealogy, there is another person in there, but she's isolating those three. And I'm saying that Enoch, when Jude is referencing Enoch, he's saying that his message was the judgment hour message. That the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all. And I would argue that Miller's was the judgment hour message. Okay, so what I'm saying is Enoch is the first angel's message. I'm not going to go in depth in this study. It's in the public record somewhere. But from the exhaustive dictionary of Bible names, Methuselah, which I'm saying the second angel's message, it says man of the dart / spear, or alternatively, his death shall bring. So Methuselah's name means his death shall bring. And I'm arguing that, and I'll go into the Hebrew before I do my argument. Anyway, I won't. But it's pretty consistent, Strong's, with what I just read from the exhaustive dictionary of Bible names. I'm arguing that let me put it this way. The Bible tells us in Genesis 5:21 through 27, if you want to go there. I accept these things that I'm going to put on the board as valid. Let each man be fully persuaded in their own mind, okay? What I mean by that is the Bible tells us in Genesis 5, 21 through 27, Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. So I'm going to say this is Enoch before he begat Methuselah, and he was 65 years old. And I'm saying that this 65 corresponds to another 65 that we find connected with the 2520. Okay? And that the Bible tells us that Enoch was the seventh from Adam. And Miller's raised up in 1798, which is at the end of a 2520. It's at the end of a seventh. So you've got, if you're willing to see, you've got some justification for putting Enoch as a symbol of Miller. But I'm saying Methuselah is a prophetic message that when he dies, the flood's going to come. Okay, he's going to die over here in the time of Noah, which I'm saying is the third message, typified, second, first. And there's much that you can do with this, but I'm going to keep it simple because it isn't, this study isn't to the, when we do this study, it's not designed to make this point about time setting, so I'm going to leave some of it out. In early writings, page 232, point 1. It says, angels of God accompanied William Miller in his mission. He was firm and undaunted, fearlessly proclaiming the message committed to his trust. And at the bottom of the paragraph, that message is expressed from Revelation. It says, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come. The second coming of Christ and the judgment hour message was committed in this first quote in Testimonies, volume 6, to Enoch, and the same message was committed to Miller. Okay, so I'm saying Miller, Enoch, first angel's message, Methuselah, second angel's message, and okay, couple other quotes. A Great Controversy 310. Great Controversy 310, it was needful that men should be awakened to their danger and that they should be roused to prepare for the solemn events connected with the close of probation. This is Miller's message, this is Enoch's message, but I'm saying the second message here is Methuselah, and that message is represented in his name, that when he dies it shall come. And then I'm going to challenge you to think through what you probably already thought through before. We know that the scriptures tell us that in the time period of Noah, there was 120 years of probationary time given to them, and they knew it. But knowing that you have 120 years probationary time doesn't mean a thing if you don't know when that 120 years began. And there's no evidence in the scriptures of when that 120 years began, unless you know something that I don't know of. Have you ever found a starting point for the 120 years? So you do know, though, that the 120 ends right here, right? When the door closes. You guys are kind of silent. So they had a time prophecy that was testing them, but because they didn't have no starting point, they couldn't calculate an ending point. Right? So in that initial history, they were going to be tested by a time prophecy. They knew what it was, but when did they get tested? This is the premise of Brother George's sermon. When did they get tested? by that time prophecy. At the death of Methuselah. Because at the death of Methuselah, his name means when he dies, it shall come. So if he dies in 2018, you know he's going to be there in 2018. You know you've reached the year of the flood. And I'm saying year because that seems like the maximum that you could spread that thought out. When they got to the 120th year, they didn't know when it was started, but they knew that when he died, the flood was coming. And it was, I'm arguing, within 1 year of the close of probation. Do you follow the logic? Okay, because if I can show you that logic 2 or 3 times, it would be established. Yes? Okay, so go to, for a second witness on this concept of being tested by the element of time. And what I intend to do here is go through Noah, go through Abraham, Moses, perhaps Christ, but definitely the Millerites. We only need 2 or 3 witnesses. This would be Abraham here. And what I'm going to try to show here is that when you get to the close of probation in each of these reform lines, when you get close to it, then the issue of time tests the people of that generation. Okay, it's not like Miller understood in 1818 his message, but his message was wrong. He thought it was 1843. It wasn't until July of 1844 that they actually got the airtight date. Okay, it was at the very end of that history, and that's the emphasis I'm putting on this. But there's a couple other things that I intend to share about covenant lines as we get through. This is the story of Abraham. This is the story of Moses. This is the story of Christ. And I want to show you that in these stories, not only are they tested on time, but they're tested on specific time prophecies, and that the time prophecies themselves come in 2 ways. They come in a complete prophetic line and a prophetic line that's divided in half. Okay, that can be divided in half, I guess is the way to say it. What I mean by that is that over here in the story of Moses, this is Moses' line here, we know that there's a 400-year prophecy, but that same prophecy in the scriptures is defined as 430 years, and this 430-year prophecy can be divided right in the middle, creating 215 and 215. And this division of these 2 halves of 430 produces an additional light, but both of these time prophecies being the same time prophecy, they're going to test the generation of Moses. So if you haven't followed what I'm saying, I'm going to try teaching 2 things as we go down through here on covenant lines. One of them is that just before probation closes, the element of time is opened up. And the other one is that there's going to be two prophetic lines that are going to test God's people. And they will also, one of them at least, will be able to be divided right in the middle. And when it's divided in the middle, it will produce additional prophetic implications. Okay, so I only added that in now because I want you to see something in Genesis 15. Genesis 15, I'm arguing that is the beginning. This is the first angel's message. This is the beginning of the covenant relationship that the Lord has with Abraham. And the first subject that's introduced is that Abraham says, I don't have a child. So this becomes the theme all the way through, is that Abraham doesn't have a child, all the way through to chapter 22, which is the third angel's message, when he's going to sacrifice that child in obedience to God's command. So it's about the child all the way through. That comes up in the first couple of verses, and then the Lord is going to ask Abraham to go count the stars. First thing he has to do, the first place the scriptures identify Abraham's righteousness was in his willingness to follow God's command to go count the calendar. Okay, we already mentioned that. And in verse 7 it says, And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? Because now Abraham wants to know, how do I know you're going to fulfill your word? And the Lord says, take me a heifer of 3 years old, a she-goat 3 years old, and a ram 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. 5 offerings, right? Are those all legitimate sanctuary offerings? I mean, there isn't no pig in there, is there? These are all legitimate offerings. Say amen if you think it's amen. Amen. Say no if you think it's no. Okay. So, pardon me? We're in Genesis chapter 15, verse 9. And so what are those offerings? This is simple, basic Adventism. What are those offerings? If they're all legitimate offerings, what are they?
Representing Christ.
They're typifying Christ. Are they not? Every one of those offerings is pointing forward to the antitypical offering. Therefore, because they are typifying Christ, what are they? They're prophecies. Aren't they pointing forward to his great sacrifice? Okay, so these 5 offerings are, it's a prophecy, because I think most of you agree, some of you were kind of silent, most of you agree that they all typified Christ. That makes them prophecies. Yes? Okay, what's he going to do with them? He's going to take 3 of them. He's going to divide those 3 in half, but the 2 small ones are just going to be singular offerings. So I want you to see right from the beginning that Abraham, right from the start, has 2 types of prophecy. One that you don't divide in half, and another type of prophecy that you divide in half. So right here in a very simple fashion, okay? The basic premise of this coming down to the 126 and the 151 is right there in those offerings. You follow my logic? Okay, so, but it's always about the son, the seed of Abraham. So if you just scroll through to chapter 17. But chapter 17 is where I argue that this is the second angel's message. And if you're familiar with this message, you know that when the angel comes down with the little book open in his hand, and you take and eat it, that when you eat that little book, that you're therefore called by thy name, O Lord God of hosts, according to Jeremiah. You enter into a covenant relationship, and there's a name change. And in chapter 17, this is where Abram's name is going to be changed to Abraham, Sarai's name is going to be changed to Sarah. 9/11 all over the place. But I want you to see something. In verse 7, we could read several verses here because it's the whole theme. Verse 7 says, I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee and thy generations. And you could argue at a surface level, well, all that means Ishmael is his seed. But the Lord isn't speaking that way. The Lord's saying, I'm going to establish my covenant with your seed, and it's going to be your seed that comes through Sarah. Okay, so we know that. We don't have to stumble over that. Verse 10, this is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. And this is where circumcision is introduced. You can say a lot about circumcision and the necessity of baptism now in this history. I don't know of those of you that are baptized into this movement or thinking about it. If there's one study on it that I like, that I would point you to, I'd take a look at Tamina's presentations in Arkansas here recently. She has some really good logic along that line. Okay, so in verse 15 of Genesis 17 it says, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, thy wife, thou shalt call her name Sarah, but Sarai, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. and I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Now the Lord's being specific. The seed is coming through Sarah, and I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. The kings of peoples shall be of her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Abraham laughs at the idea that this old woman that he's been married to for so many decades could possibly have a baby. Okay, but in verse 19 it says, and God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. Verse 21, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. And what I want you to see here now the birth of Isaac is at a set time. And a set time in prophecy is a prophetic fulfillment. Abraham is being tested on a time prophecy right here. It's a set time. And in chapter 18, verse 10, the same story is going on. Chapter 18, verse 10, it says, and he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed. So both Abraham and Sarah are scoffing at the idea that at a certain time something was going to happen. They didn't believe it. Okay? Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. Verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord at the time appointed? And what do you suppose the Hebrew word translated time appointed is? I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, but it's M-O-E-D. I say moed. Okay, I might be pronouncing it wrong, but it's the same word that's used in the book of Daniel when he talks about the appointed time or the time appointed. And we've understood for years that the appointed time or the time appointed in the book of Daniel is identifying the conclusion of a time prophecy. So Sarah and Abraham in this history are being tested by a time prophecy that's predicting that at a certain time Isaac is going to be born. And they represent those that laugh about time prophecy. And when the son is born, what do they name him? Laughter. They name him Isaac. And Isaac becomes a symbol of those that scoff over the idea of God's people being tested upon definite time. So you can see that in the story of Abram, if you're willing to see. Now, this story of Noah isn't actually what I would say you can put in the covenant lines, because the logic I use on covenant lines is with Abraham, the Lord is entering into covenant with a chosen, peculiar people, but the Lord's interaction with Noah is with all mankind. But it still possesses the necessary characteristics to add to this argument. But if we're going to use Abram as the starting point of the illustration of God's covenant people, then I'm arguing that he illustrates the 144,000, the last covenant people. Therefore, the first covenant people, as typified by Abram, they were tested upon time. And they represent those people in that history that scoff at definite time when it's opened up to them. And how far off in the distance was it opened up to them? We read it. At the appointed time next year. Within a year of the event, down in here, it's opened up to them. This is being 1 year. It's opened up to them that this is going to happen, and both of them scoff. And that was the point of Brother George's presentation, is that it's right before the close of probation when the element of definite time is opened up. You all with me? When did we start? 4:30?
Oh, it's been 8 and 4:30. 4:40 sounds good.
How much time do you have on your machine?
You have 3 hours a week.
Oh, okay.
It's got loads of 40 minutes.
Okay, so let's go to Numbers
It's got like 20 minutes.
22. I don't know why I'm going to Numbers 22, I'm sorry. $14. I'm going to Numbers 14. I'm wanting to get to verse 22 in Numbers 14, but I said Numbers 22, my apologies, and it was about Balaam. And this will be Moses' story, but I want to add some things about Moses in here that we've already dealt with. How old is Moses right before they go in and conquer Jericho? It's 120. How's his life divided up? In the 340s. And would it be okay to say his first 40 years, could I put rebellion on his first 40 years? I mean, I get it that it's probably not fully accurate, but he tried to take the Lord's work into his own hand and he murdered the Egyptian, right? Okay, so that first 40 years, it'd be okay to put like rebel on it, is that all right? And then he goes 40 years out in the wilderness, right? And what's he doing? He's getting trained up to manage God's people, but how's he getting trained? He's a shepherd, okay? And then when he comes back, the last 40 years, he's like a well-organized king, right? He's been trained in the school of Pharaoh, he's been trained in the 40 years in the wilderness, and he's managing a big group of people. So I would submit to you that 40 can also line up with the rebel that is King Saul, and the King David that was the shepherd, and Solomon, the one that was organizing the building of the temple. Okay. So that 120 that is in this history with Moses is speaking to this 120, and it's also speaking to Abraham being 120 years old when he's going to sacrifice Isaac. So we're seeing this 120 in all the lines, and I'm just tying in something that we said last night. But Numbers 14, the children of Israel are right here, let's say. And Joshua and Caleb have come back with the 10 foolish spies and said, we can go in and take the land. And how many years are they going to wander in the wilderness? I'm going to put Jericho here as the Sunday law. Just as in a generic sense. This is the end of the 40 years. But how many years have they been at this point already out of Egypt? Pardon me?
2 years.
2. That's 38. Which is 40 years. There's so many things to plug in as you build the covenant line story going through. Some of these aren't germane to what we're speaking of. But I'm arguing, and the way you can see this if you haven't looked at it before, is do a word search in the scriptures of self-same. Okay, it's a word that marks the covenant. And so when the Lord brought them out of Egypt through the Red Sea on the self-same day, it was the self-same day that had been predicted by these two time prophecies, depending on how you want to treat them, whether you want to treat it 400 or 430 years. When the time was up, they're brought through the Red Sea on the self-same day. Run self-same, you'll see it's marking covenant. The Lord has entered into covenant with them here at the Red Sea crossing. They've been baptized into the Red Sea. And 2 years later, they failed 10 tests. The 10th test being the test that's represented by Joshua and Caleb being rejected. And in verse 20, let's start in verse, pardon me, I'm in Numbers 14. Moses is, let's back up a little ways. Verse 11 of Numbers 14. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be ere they believe me for all the signs which I've showed among them? And in this message and movement, we have taken the time to show that the question, how long, always produces the answer, the Sunday law. So how long is this people going to provoke them? Until they get to Jericho. Because Sister White's going to say Jericho lines up with the loud cry at the Sunday law. So they're going to come to their conclusion by the time you get to the Sunday law. But this is the day of provocation that runs throughout the scriptures that Paul takes up in the book of Hebrews, this particular day. And the Lord is wanting to wipe them out and start over. And in verse 13, Moses says, then the Egyptians shall hear it, for thou broughtest up this people in thy might from among them. So Moses begins to argue with the Lord, not to wipe them out, but because it would dishonor his word. So in verse 20, in this dialogue that's going on, it says, and the Lord said, I've pardoned according to thy word, but as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. This allows us to bring this history into our history, because we know at 9/11 the work that began is the work that fills the earth with the glory of the Lord. And verse 22 says, because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice, surely they shall not see the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoked me see it. And in verse 34 is the verse that we referred to that I mentioned last night. After the number of the days in which you search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall you bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and you shall know my breach of promise. And earlier on, I'm going to back up now, when the whole congregation is in verse 4, there, before we got to the conclusion, when the congregation is rebellion, before this pronouncement comes, in verse 4 it says, and they said one to another, let us make a captain and let us return into Egypt. In this rebellion here, which was the final rebellion, they're going to select a captain because they want to go back to Egypt. I just want to use a little bit of sanctified logic here. I hope it's sanctified. I hope you can follow the logic. If they were going back to Egypt, what were they rejecting? If they were so frustrated with what had happened that they determined they needed to go back to Egypt, what was it that they were rejecting? I know you're going to say, well, they were rejecting the Lord, they were rejecting Moses, but that's not the answer I'm looking for. The sign. The time. They were rejecting these promises. Where did these promises come from? They come from Genesis 15 with Abram when he's walking through the midst of the fire, confirming to Abraham that promise that his people, Abraham's people, were going to go into bondage in Egypt, and he was going to bring them out at the end of 400/430 years and enter into covenant with him. So if they're wanting to return to Egypt, they're rejecting these time prophecies. You follow the logic? This is the time prophecies that were identifying for them that it was time that the Lord would deliver them out of Egypt. Did they know that early on? Did Moses not already know, have some kind of inkling that he was the deliverer when he slayed the Egyptian? The Hebrews had to know too. I mean, it may not have been fully common knowledge, but they knew the time was near. But here, when they're assigning themselves to death, what they're rejecting at one level are these two time prophecies. And what I want you to see here is this 400 years is pretty much a singular period of time. But if you divide it right in the middle, it's showing 250 years, 15 years that they're in Palestine, followed by 215 years that they're in Egypt. So you're seeing two different histories speaking to the overall story, and if nothing out, that justification provides the logic when you're dividing the 25-20 and a half and seeing that there's 1260 years that paganism is trampling down God and his people, followed by 1260 years that papalism's trampling down God and his people. These time prophecies that test each generation, the one that's divided in half produces further light beyond the simple straight line time prophecy. And you know where I'm going with this, right? In our history, 151, 126. But both of them can produce light when they're divided in half in our history. Okay? So that's a simple, what I'm simply saying is that this here, Abraham, Moses, is speaking, this being the beginning of ancient Israel, it's speaking to the end of ancient Israel, which I'm saying is Christ. And I'm also saying that there are, and the problem with how I say this is you may think that I'm saying that there are only two. But as we go through, especially in Millerite history, there's more than two prophecies. But I'm going to point to two prophecies in the history of Christ at the end of ancient Israel that are going to test God's people. And one of them is 490 years. And the other one is the final week of that 490 years. And it can be divided right in the middle. So, I was telling Brother Mangent the other day on the way here a story about Caesarea Philippi. And I was wondering about where is Caesarea Philippi in the story of Matthew?
16.
It's 16. Yeah. Yes.
16:13.
Yep. I'm just looking for the chapter. Okay, I'm going to start with verse 21. I was telling Manjit this, and then Parminder started right in on this subject this morning, so I don't know what that means, but I'll tell you what I'm telling Manjit and what I'm meaning right now. In verse 21 of Matthew 16, it says, "From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised again the third day." Hadn't Jesus already said those things to the disciples? Some of you are saying yes. Is it yes or no? Yes, he'd already been saying this. But for some reason here, it is especially marked. And it says from that time. It's at this point here that he is now speaking more directly, more clearly, more specifically. Is it okay to say that? Are you following my logic? So I'm sometimes wondering when Brother Parminder is doing his parable teaching, which he began to elaborate on today, does there not reach a point in time right before the end where the parable teaching gets set aside and you just get direct and to the point? But as I heard what he was saying today, I don't think so. Okay, so he corrected my thought. But it doesn't detract from the point I want to make. The point I want to make on this study is I'm going to argue that at Caesarea Philippi, however you choose to say that, just before the cross, this is when that very event is opened up to the disciples, even though he's been teaching them, and even though some of them were familiar with these time prophecies here. This is where definite time becomes a testing truth for the disciples, and it's just before he's going to Jerusalem. It's at the end of his ministry. The point being is the Lord opens up definite time just before the end. Okay, so this here produces two elements. He's confirming the covenant with many for 1 week in person, and in the second half of the week he's confirming it in the presence of his disciples. But it's this history here and this special little history here that is testing God's people in their history, just as they were tested on definite prophetic time in the beginning history of ancient Israel. So, are you following the logic? If we can, and I'm sure we can if nothing goes wrong, we're going to come back to Matthew 16 and look at Caesarea Philippi in the context of Paneum. But that's a day or so off. So what I'm saying is this. I'm arguing that it's right here in Caesarea Philippi, where in verse 21 he says, from that time forth began Jesus to teach about this. It's right here that the close of probation issue is opened up. It's not at his baptism. It's at the end. It's just before we're getting to the end when definite time is opened up to us. It was just a year away with Abraham, just a year away with Methuselah. 2 prophecies, one divided in the middle, the other not. And this brings us to Millerite history. And Millerite history has 2 prophecies. But it has more than 2 prophecies, right? This is where you really get bogged down with this logic, if you want to get bogged down. But I'm going to use the 2300 and the 2520. And I'm going to take the 2520 against the northern kingdom to keep it simple. It's divided right in the middle. 538, producing 2 periods of 1260, the 2300, a singular prophecy. The 2300 and the 2520 were both testing the Millerite history. And I just want to put something in place, because it got mentioned at lunch, maybe. Yeah, at lunch. And someone that I thought was supposed to should have understood this didn't seem to understand it. And I want to make sure everyone understands it on this particular subject. The argument is out there. This is totally off subject of what we're doing here. I'm sorry. Bad idea to do at the very conclusion of something. But it does fit into here. The argument's made is that after October 22nd, 1844, Sister White speaks against time setting, and many of the people that are trying to demonstrate a justification for setting time here at the end, they go in and they try to argue that every time that Sister White's referring to time setting, that she's referring to the second coming of Christ exclusively, or to October 22nd, 1844 exclusively. I don't care how they argue it, but I want to argue something that may not square up with that, and it's this. I'm going to bring it over here. If this is October 22nd, 1844, and from this point on, the Millerites weren't supposed to understand definite time. Is that how we understand it? Then I'm arguing that I'm not so sure that I agree with that. Because in 1856, Hiram Edson is going to write a unfinished series of articles on the 2520, where he's going to argue that Miller was wrong. He shouldn't have used the 2520 against Judah as he did, but he should have used the 2520 against the northern kingdom of Israel. And in March of 2005, these articles of Hiram Edson came to light in this movement, and when we seen those articles, we came to understand that both 2520s were valid. And that tells me that in 1856, the Millerites also could have understood that both 2520s were valid. And in those articles, one of the main points of references for Hiram Edson in those articles is Isaiah 65 years in Isaiah chapter 7. So Isaiah 7 gave the Millerites the point of reference to clearly see. Hiram Edson clearly taught that 742 BC is when Isaiah 7 was penned, and he clearly taught that 723 was within the midst of this 65-year time prophecy. So what I'm saying is, in 1856, the Lord was giving the light to the Millerites that he gave to us in 2005 that would have provided them the ability to recognize the chiasm of the 2520 that ended in 1863. And had they recognized it, I think they would have had the responsibility to put it in the public record, just like we did. So when we're saying, whatever we're saying about Sister White's comments about no more time prophecy after 1844, the historical record is that the Lord tried to bring the fuller understanding of the 2520 to the surface in the Millerite history, but they couldn't see it because they were getting ready to go in to 4 generations of escalating disobedience. So, we probably, can you see this? I'll close with this because this is one of the places that I'm going to. If you all follow that logic, right? Yes? Okay. We're being tested, I'm arguing now, we're also being tested by 2 time prophecies. I'm arguing it's the 126 and the 151. But unlike these over here, both of them can be divided in the middle. And that's okay, because you can see that this testing truth develops through history. Here it's just 5 animals. Half of them are divided in half, 3 of them, 2 of them aren't. It's a truth that gets bigger and fuller as it goes down through history, so the fact that we end up with 2 and they can both be divided isn't a denial of anything. But if you start in 1863 and you go 126 years into the future, where does it take you to? Are you having to add this? 126 years into the future from 1863 is 1989. isn't it? So if you go in 1888 and you go 126 years in the future, where does it take you to? 2014. Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Did you say 20?
2014.
2014. Okay. Would it be okay to put a 7 there? If there's a 7 here? Because if it is okay,
2021.
it takes you to 2021. And I want to start developing some thoughts about 2021. And this is at least one point of reference to begin. And I know, I've dealt here recently especially with one person that finally backed down. They might not say back down, but that's the way I would describe it, okay? They backed down. And their emphasis was correct, as far as I can understand. Their emphasis was, look at, we have what, 11 months as priest to get ready for the close of probation? What other subject should we be looking at? Why you got that confused look back there? Just far away? Yes. Okay. If you want to challenge me, I want you to challenge me right now here in front of everyone. But in any case, they backed down, and the reason they backed down is I get the emphasis that there should be nothing else that we're looking at other than November 9th, 2019, that this is where the door is going to close. We need to understand that fully. But I'm not convinced that there isn't things even beyond 2019, prophetic truths, that the Lion of the tribe of Judah wants us to understand, that the understanding of those truths will also better prepare us for November 9th, 2019. I'm not ready to say that this is the only thing that we're going to look at until the Lion of the tribe of Judah actually says that. And that's not how I understand it. I understood prophecy was a light that only got brighter and brighter. It doesn't get just focused down to one point. So I hope you understand that I'm not trying to denigrate what we need to come to grips with November 9th, 2019. But I'm not so sure that the Lord isn't putting into place something about 2021. And other than, I felt really comfortable about what I was going to say next, until this brother here challenged me in the last presentation, and I thought, oh, I have to think this one through. Okay, and what I'm saying here is, I'm going to use the same prophetic logic that Sister Tess used, if you remember her presentations, when she put November 9th, 2019, and then she would back up 30 years, or she'd back up 120 years, or she'd back up 220, or 126, or 151, or 490 years, and she would identify histories that took place 490 years before 2019, or 220, that would contribute to the characteristics that we expect to see on November 9, 2019. I'm going to do the very same thing for 2021. And they line up. They work. The histories at the beginning correspond to 2021 if you're understanding 21 to be the midnight cry in Paneum. They're getting those kind of characteristics and they're coming to 2021. The problem that this brother opens up for me is he's saying a third part of that test is that each of those prophetic periods have their own symbolism attached to them, such as 220 being restitution, and therefore though you have to also see that those periods of time contribute to your end conclusion. And I had never thought about that on those lines until he brought that up. But I know the beginning histories identify what we've already put in place as the midnight cry. So that's where I'm going. That's the prophetic logic I'll be using, is the same thing that Sister Tess uses for 2019. But this introduction to it with this is this history here. And it's an argument about time setting, I believe. If we could see I mean, if there's anything that got us, brothers and sisters, I used to not fight, but I was the one voice in this movement that would argue against everyone else, saying, we're not the 25-20 people. There's so much more than the 25-20. Don't let them label us as the 25-20 people. There's too much beyond just the 25-20. But I never prevailed. We're the 25-20 people, okay? But the 25-20, one of the things it did, it got us locked in as time setters before we even knew it. Because as soon as we seen the chiastic structure in 2005, and we could see that that went all the way to 1863, and we began to see all the evidence that 1863 was the conclusion of that chiastic structure, then we were saying we agreed that the prophetic periods extended beyond October 22nd, 1844. And we were already on a path of no return and didn't even know it. Okay? I didn't know it. So my point being is, this waymark here is the very waymark where the beginning of Adventism had the opportunity to come to grips that the prophetic periods actually extended even further than they thought, in spite of the council that began to take place at that period of time. And this chiastic structure is speaking to the 126, but it's speaking to our history, this reform movement here, and I just can't get away from it, that this 7 years projects us to 2021, and that it's a chiasm, and it's connected with the 25-20. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your invariableness, that you never change, that you're the same yesterday, today, and forever. That we can believe that we can look at how you interacted with Noah and Abraham and Moses, all these histories, and have confidence that you will do the same to the end of time. We've had to grapple with hard concepts as we look at the testimony of Sister White in the time period of Adventism. We have difficulty recognizing that Adventism is the Church of Laodicea and we're the Church of Ephesus, and because we're having difficulty recognizing that, we sometimes find it hard to make a break between that dispensation and our dispensation, but we ask that you give us grace to do that. The evidence is too abundant that you have given a definite time, and that we have a responsibility to come to grips with that and present it to the world. We thank you for the easy time that we're having here in Wales so far, for your presence. We ask for continued blessing upon these studies as we go through the rest of these days. In Jesus' name, amen.